living in a world where a single unanswered question hangs over your life for decades. Who killed them? For families of cold case victims, time becomes a cruel companion, turning hope into habit and grief into silence. But what if, after 40 or 50 years, the truth finally comes out, through a chance confession, a discarded water bottle, or the marvel of modern DNA technology? In 2025, that's exactly what happened. This year didn't just bring justice. It unearthed chilling secrets buried under decades of lies. These are cases so old, most people thought they would never see a resolution. Yet here we are, standing in an age where science and persistence are rewriting history, case by case. Today, we're diving into real stories of cold cases finally solved in 2025 with shocking twists that stunned investigators and families alike. From a beloved English teacher stabbed in broad daylight to a brutal home invasion that lingered unsolved for more than 2 decades. These stories reveal that killers can run, but they cannot hide forever. Each case closed this year tells us something terrifying. Justice may sleep, but it never dies. Let's start with one of the most haunting cases in California's history. A crime scene that shocked an entire high school in 1978. In June 1978, the corridors of a San Jose high school turned into the setting of a nightmare. Diane Peterson was only 26 years old, a bright and ambitious English teacher who loved literature and believed in shaping young minds. That morning began like any other, with students shuffling through classes and teachers preparing lessons. But by midday, screams echoed through the halls. Diane had been found staggering through the corridor, bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds. She collapsed on the school grounds, surrounded by horrified students and faculty. Within minutes, the vibrant educator was gone. The investigation that followed should have been straightforward. The attack happened in daylight inside a school building full of witnesses. Detectives collected fingerprints, canvassed for suspects, and interviewed dozens of people. A few students recalled seeing a figure running away, but no one could identify the attacker with certainty. And despite the presence of fingerprints, nothing matched in the system. As days turned into weeks, the case grew cold. The killer had vanished, leaving behind a blood-soaked mystery that haunted the community for years. Fast forward nearly 5 decades later. In early 2025, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit stunned the public with an announcement. The Diane Peterson case had been officially solved. And the twist? The answer didn't come from new DNA technology or an anonymous tip. It came from a confession buried in family secrets. Authorities revealed that Harry "Nicky" Nickerson, a 16-year-old student at the time of the murder, had privately confessed to the killing to a relative shortly after the crime. Nickerson took his own life in 1993, leaving no chance for prosecution. But in 2025, that relative finally came forward, unable to live with the truth any longer. Combined with eyewitness statements and circumstantial evidence, investigators closed the case for good. Diane's family got the answer they had waited nearly 50 years for. Though the man responsible had been dead for decades, the confession raised a chilling question. How many secrets like this are still locked away in family conversations, waiting to shatter the silence? That wasn't the only ghost of the past to come back to life in 2025. Across the country, another case cracked open after more than 50 years. A murder so brutal, it shocked Indiana in the early 1970s. Phyllis Baylor was a 24-year-old mother of 3 living in rural Allen County, Indiana, in 1972. Her life was simple, quiet, defined by family and faith. But one late summer evening, everything changed. Phyllis was found dead on the side of a country road, shot and raped. Her 3-year-old daughter discovered nearby, alive but terrified. The crime made headlines for its sheer brutality and randomness. Police worked tirelessly, collecting evidence and interviewing potential suspects. But despite their efforts, the case stagnated. There were no eyewitnesses, no viable suspects, and the limited forensic technology of the time left investigators with little to go on. For decades, the murder of Phyllis Baylor lingered in silence, a dark chapter in local history, with a family left to endure the agony of unanswered questions. But 2025 would change everything. Thanks to advancements in genetic genealogy, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer, investigators were able to pull DNA from preserved evidence and run it through genealogy databases. The result was a breakthrough no one expected: a man named Fred Allen Lieneman. At the time of the murder, Lieneman had no criminal record and no direct ties to Phyllis beyond proximity. He lived an unremarkable life and died in Detroit in 1985, decades before his name surfaced in this investigation. The announcement left Phyllis's surviving family stunned. For 50 years, they lived with doubt, anger, and fear. And now, while the killer could never face trial, the truth had finally spoken. It was a bittersweet justice, proof that even the oldest wounds can find closure when science and persistence converge. And then there's a case that dragged on for nearly half a century before the pieces finally fit. A string of murders so brutal they were once linked to the infamous Hillside Strangler case. In 1977, Ventura County, California, became the hunting ground for a serial predator. 3 women, all sex workers, were found strangled and dumped in remote areas. Detectives initially believed these murders might be tied to the Hillside Strangler killings that terrorized Los Angeles around the same time. But the connection never materialized. For decades, the murders of these 3 women remained unsolved, becoming a tragic footnote in California's long history of unsolved crimes. In August 2024, the case finally cracked wide open, and in 2025 it dominated headlines. DNA technology linked the murders to Warren Luther Alexander, a man already serving time for unrelated crimes. The revelation was explosive, proving that the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. Alexander was extradited and charged with the murders, and for families who had waited nearly 50 years, the arrest was a seismic moment. Justice delayed, yes, but not denied. The theme of time folding in on itself repeated in Maryland with the brutal murder of Leslie Prior in 2001. Leslie was a successful advertising executive, the kind of person who seemed destined for a long, vibrant life. But one day, she was found dead in her own home, beaten and strangled, with DNA under her fingernails hinting at a violent struggle. The case frustrated detectives for over 2 decades. Even with modern forensic tools, no match emerged. That all changed in 2025 when investigators turned to advanced genealogy techniques combined with an old-fashioned tip from a neighbor. They zeroed in on Eugene Gliger, a man who had lived near Leslie at the time of her death. Detectives tailed him discreetly, eventually snagging a discarded bottle at an airport. The DNA matched. Confronted with the evidence, Gliger confessed, but what stunned investigators was his demeanor. He showed no remorse, no emotion, as if he had erased the crime from his own memory. It was only when detectives laid out the genetic evidence that his mask slipped. For Leslie's family, the revelation brought both relief and horror, a reminder that evil can live quietly next door for decades. And then there's the case of Edna Schubert, an 88-year-old widow from Suffolk County, New York, whose savage killing in 2003 shocked the community. Her home was her sanctuary, yet it became the scene of unimaginable violence. For years, detectives scoured every lead. Nothing stuck, but in 2025, an investigative team cracked the case using a combination of enhanced fingerprint analysis and DNA lifted from something as mundane as a Gatorade bottle tossed into the trash. That bottle belonged to Raul Ayala, Edna's neighbor at the time. For 22 years, he walked free, living an ordinary life, until science finally cornered him. His arrest sent ripples through the quiet community, proving that even when killers vanish into the shadows of time, the truth has a way of finding them. And finally, perhaps the most extraordinary twist of all, a case stretching back nearly 6 decades to Bristol, UK. In 1967, pensioner Louisa Dunn was raped and murdered in a crime that horrified her neighborhood. Witnesses recalled screams, but the killer melted into obscurity. For almost 60 years, the file gathered dust, until cutting-edge DNA and palm print matching technology brought the past roaring back to life. In 2025, authorities arrested a 92-year-old man, now frail and wheelchair-bound, for Louisa's murder. When the verdict came guilty, he became the oldest person in UK history to be sentenced for murder. For many, the conviction was a chilling reminder. The clock may tick, but it doesn't erase accountability. What these cases teach us is profound. Technology changes, but persistence is timeless. In a world where genealogy databases and forensic breakthroughs are rewriting history, no killer should feel safe, no matter how many years have passed. You'd think that after decades of silence, the voices of victims would fade. But the truth is, in cold cases, silence only grows louder. Every unsolved murder becomes a shadow in the room. Families live with it, detectives retire with it, and communities carry it like a scar. What makes these stories remarkable isn't just that they were solved in 2025. It's how they were solved, and what those solutions tell us about justice, time, and the monsters hiding behind ordinary faces. When Diane Peterson's killer was finally unmasked through a family confession, the news spread like wildfire across California. Teachers who had worked with her were in their 70s now, some battling health problems, yet they came forward to speak. One retired colleague told reporters, "We always knew it was someone close. We just never thought the truth would come this late." That's the haunting power of time. It doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it deepens them. The revelation that a 16-year-old student, someone Diane had likely smiled at, spoken to, maybe even encouraged, was the killer turned the narrative upside down. It wasn't a stranger who crept in from the outside. It was someone inside those walls, sitting in those very classrooms. For the family, it was devastating but clarifying. They had spent decades imagining a faceless predator. Now they knew. And with knowledge came the ability to finally let her rest. But what happens when the person responsible dies before the truth emerges? That's the cruel reality of many of these cases. For the Baylor family in Indiana, the DNA match to Fred Allen Lieneman was both a blessing and a curse. After 50 years, there was finally a name. But no trial, no day in court, no chance to look a killer in the eye and ask, why? Investigators said Lieneman's name never crossed their radar during the original investigation. He wasn't on any watch list. He wasn't a known offender. That's the frightening part. How many ordinary men have carried extraordinary evil inside them, walking among us unnoticed? For the Baylor children, now in their 60s and 70s, the closure was tinged with anger. One daughter told a reporter, "All these years, we prayed for justice. We got an answer, but not justice. And yet, these answers matter. They matter because they shatter the illusion that murderers can simply vanish into the fog of time. They matter because they prove that science has no expiration date." When Warren Luther Alexander was arrested for the Ventura Strangler murders, the ripple effect hit hard. Imagine being the families of those 3 women sex workers, forgotten by a system that barely looked for their killers in the first place. For decades, their names weren't in the headlines. They were statistics in a dusty file. But in 2025, their lives and their deaths mattered again. Detectives admitted that back in the 1970s, these cases didn't get the attention they deserved because of who the victims were. That's the ugly truth about cold cases. Bias kills as effectively as any weapon. This is a recurring theme. Many of these victims were women on the margins, sex workers, single mothers, elderly widows. They lived lives that society often overlooks, and their killers exploited that invisibility. In Edna Schubert's case, the brutality of the attack stood in stark contrast to the banality of the motive. Raul Ayala didn't kill for passion or vengeance. He killed for greed, for a sense of power over someone vulnerable. And he nearly got away with it because who suspects the quiet neighbor next door? For 22 years, he carried that secret like a second skin. When detectives finally knocked on his door in Georgia, neighbors were stunned. They described him as pleasant, ordinary, the kind of guy you'd never think twice about. That phrase, "you'd never think twice," is the anthem of every cold case solved decades later. Then there's the story that shook the UK, the Louisa Dunn murder. A 92-year-old man, wheeled into a courtroom, hearing a jury pronounce him guilty for a crime committed nearly 60 years earlier. The image went viral because it collided 2 realities: the fragility of old age and the permanence of guilt. People asked, what's the point of convicting a man who's almost at death's door? But for Louisa's descendants, the answer was simple. It was never about the killer's age. It was about reclaiming her dignity. It was about proving that her life mattered enough for justice to pursue it to the bitter end. And justice, when it comes this late, isn't just legal, it's cultural. These cases spark conversations about ethics, technology, and privacy. Take genetic genealogy, for instance. The same databases people use to find long-lost cousins are now solving murders. Some call it brilliant, others call it intrusive. But when you sit with families who've waited 50 years for an answer, the debate feels different. One detective put it bluntly, every time someone sends their DNA to a genealogy site, they're not just mapping their family, they're building a bridge to justice. The irony is, many of these breakthroughs aren't cinematic. They don't happen in smoky interrogation rooms or with dramatic confessions. They happen in silence. A bottle tossed in a trash can, a cigarette but left on the ground, a palm print scanned into a database after decades of dust. That's how Gligor fell. That's how Ayala fell. Small, ordinary objects that outlived the lies. But beyond the science, there's something deeper, something unsettling about how killers live for decades after their crimes. They marry, raise kids, work jobs, attend weddings, go to church, all while carrying the memory of what they did. Did Raul Ayala ever glance at the Gatorade bottle before tossing it, thinking it might one day betray him? Did Eugene Gligor feel a twinge of fear every time he saw a news headline about cold cases? Or did they truly believe that time had buried their sins? If these stories teach us anything, it's this: killer's age, but evidence doesn't. Time is their alibi until it isn't. And as 2025 unfolds, this list keeps growing. Detectives are reopening boxes marked unsolved, with new eyes, new tools, and new determination. Because here's the truth: no case is truly cold. It's just waiting for the right spark to burn it open. We're about to dive even deeper, not just into the facts, but into what these cases reveal about us. About justice, about memory, about the future of crime solving. Because if 2025 taught us one thing, it's that the past never really stays buried. Stick around, because what comes next will make you rethink everything you know about cold cases and the dark patience of killers. You know what makes these stories so haunting? It's not just the killers. It's the silence that follows them. The decades where their names vanish into the fog while families keep asking, why? We've already seen what persistence and science can do. But if you thought the last batch of cases was shocking, what's coming next will make you question everything you think you know about justice, time, and human nature. Because these cases don't just tell us about killers, they tell us about systems that failed, communities that forgot, and technology that rose from the ashes of neglect to rewrite history. Let's start with the story that left even seasoned detectives shaken: the Diane Peterson case. We covered the confession, but what we didn't cover was the ripple effect. The teachers who came out of retirement to talk, the students who were teenagers then and grandparents now, the whispers in classrooms that suddenly sounded like screams in hindsight. Some of them remembered Harry Nicky Nickerson as quiet, awkward, but polite. Others remembered flashes of anger. What no one saw was the obsession that brewed inside him, the one that led him to kill a teacher he probably admired, maybe even desired. Investigators believe jealousy might have played a role. Diane had just turned down a student for tutoring, and rumor had it Nicky was infatuated. It's speculation, but the pattern fits something experts call resentment-based violence, a term often associated with school shooters today. Except this was 1978, long before anyone had a word for it. And when the truth came out in 2025, the confession didn't come from Nicky. It came from his brother, now in his 60s, burdened by a secret for 40 years. Imagine that weight. Every family barbecue, every holiday dinner, knowing your brother killed a woman and walked free until his own suicide. What does that do to a family? How does silence poison bloodlines? That's the story no headline tells. But this isn't an isolated theme. The Phyllis Baylor case out of Indiana shows another kind of silence, the institutional one. For decades, the file sat gathering dust because resources were thin and priorities were skewed. A murdered mother of 3 wasn't enough to keep investigators pushing once leads dried up. That changed when a fragment of DNA, stored in a deteriorating envelope, became the golden ticket in 2024. What fascinates criminologists is that this wasn't a new discovery. It was old evidence seen through a new lens. Genetic genealogy cracked the case by building a family tree that stretched across states, linking a man who died in 1985 to a murder he probably thought was buried with him. And here's where the ethical debate flares up. These techniques use relatives' DNA, people who've committed no crime, to triangulate suspects. Some call it revolutionary, others call it invasive. But when you watch the Baylor family sob in relief, when you hear a granddaughter say, "Now I can visit her grave and feel peace," the argument feels less abstract, because at the heart of it all is a simple truth. Technology isn't just solving murders. It's restoring humanity. Then there's the Ventura Strangler. This case exposed a brutal reality, how society decides which lives matter. The victims were sex workers, and back in 1977, that label was enough to make police shrug. It's not that detectives didn't care individually. It's that the system didn't prioritize them. When the case broke in 2024, it wasn't just about catching Warren Luther Alexander. It was about an apology 50 years overdue. One activist said, "These women didn't die because they were sex workers. They died because no one looked for their killer." That sentence should haunt every law enforcement agency, because it echoes across decades. It's the same story with the Green River Killer, the Grim Sleeper, and countless others. The shocking part? Alexander wasn't some elusive drifter. He was a known offender, someone who slipped through cracks because those cracks were widened by prejudice. When DNA linked him in 2024, he was already facing unrelated charges, which means the justice system crossed paths with him before and didn't see the monster in plain sight. That's the thing about serial offenders. They're rarely ghosts. They're men with rap sheets, hiding in loopholes, waiting for the right mix of chance and negligence. And then we have the Gligor case, the Maryland murder that stunned everyone not because of its brutality, but because of how ordinary the killer seemed. Leslie Prior was a professional woman, successful, admired. Her killer? A neighbor who lived within walking distance, a man who smiled at her in passing, maybe held the door for her once. That's the detail that keeps people up at night. We expect evil to announce itself, with scars, with shadows, with something. But most of the time, it wears a clean shirt and a polite smile. What broke Gligor wasn't guilt, it was science. Detectives tailed him for weeks, waiting for the moment he'd discard something with DNA. When he left that bottle at the airport, they pounced. During interrogation, he sat stone-faced, arms crossed, until they slid the lab results across the table. That's when the mask cracked. The detective who interviewed him said later, "It wasn't fear, it was anger. Anger that the science outsmarted him. That's the predator's ego. They think they're untouchable." And for decades, they were, until now. But no case illustrates that better than the Louisa Dunn murder, the oldest of the lot, 1967. A world without cell phones, without databases, without DNA. For 60 years, her case gathered dust while generations came and went. When her killer was dragged into court in 2025, he was 92. 92. He had outlived presidents, pandemics, entire eras. And yet, the palm print he left that night in 1967 didn't age a day. When forensic tech finally caught up, it spoke louder than any denial he could muster. People online debated the point of jailing a man who'd die in months. But here's the thing. That verdict wasn't for him. It was for Louisa. It was for every headline that called her pensioner slain and moved on. It was for the idea that time bends, but it doesn't erase. And as these stories keep surfacing, they're changing the very culture of true crime. It's not about sensationalism anymore. It's about reconstruction, piecing back what time tried to erase. Podcasts, docuseries, YouTube deep dives, they're not just entertainment. They're pressure points. They're forcing cold case units to act, forcing the public to care. And maybe, just maybe, that care is the reason some of these files got reopened in the first place. So what does this all mean for the future? It means the killers who think they've outlived justice should start sweating. It means families who thought hope was dead should look at these headlines and think, maybe. It means we're living in an era where the past can't hide anymore. Because every discarded bottle, every forgotten print, every word whispered in a kitchen decades ago can be the thread that unravels the whole secret. And we're just getting started. Because if 2025 has taught us anything, it's that the ghosts of the past aren't done speaking. And when they do, the echoes are louder than ever. So don't blink. Don't turn away. Because the next case on this list is not just solved, it's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about closure.